What's up, nerds? Thanks for being here. Today I talk with my friend Dr. Zach Bowden, an assistant professor of theological studies and a scholar in the field of church history and American Christianity. We talk about some of his recent work, the value of historical theology in the life of the churches, and some of our formative experiences in theological education. He also deliberately calls me Chad at several points in the episode, but he also admits that his favorite part of his time in seminary was being my friend. Thanks for listening. All right, well, welcome, Zach. Thanks for being here. Today we're going to discuss some of your work in church history and historical theology. But first, let me ask you, what got you started in historical theology and church history? Have you always been interested in history? Did you always knew that one day you'd be a whiz-bang historical theologian? Or was it a winding journey? You can talk about the depth of your friendship with me, or how big of an encouragement I've been to you. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you for having me, Chad. No, I was not interested in church history growing up. I wasn't bookish at all, very much a video game kid, very good at it, still very good at it now. But I would say it was all seminary. It was all seminary that really got me turned on to church history, just in terms of that was my first class in seminary at 8 a.m. I remember it very well. And from there, I was just kind of hooked because it just seemed to me that you could really do everything you could ever want to do within church history. It just covers absolutely everything from hermeneutics to theology to thinking about the nature of the pastoral office to everything in between. Church history really hit it all, but it hit it within the context of these really great, fascinating stories that actually happened. And so kind of from that general church history class, I ended up taking courses on Martin Luther, who I absolutely fell in love with and didn't know squat about going into seminary, and then going on to take classes with Robert Caldwell, and his focus was on American evangelicalism, Jonathan Edwards in particular. And then I was just hooked. I couldn't get enough of it. And I still feel today that it's one of the things I love talking about the most, but I feel like I even bore my former church history professors. Like, I mean, they're even like, no, that's enough church history, Zach. Mm-hmm. And it's just something I've always just been enthusiastic about ever since seminary, and have kind of tried to incorporate it any way I can and in anything I do.
Yeah, that's good. You mentioned being able to do everything in the study of church history. One popular or definition of church history is viewing church history as the history of interpretation. Like, would you say that that's part of what you're interested in church history, or would you combine that with a genuine interest in like the historical context, or like how do you relate those, like emphasis on maybe like historical theology or biblical interpretation throughout the different ages, or the historical context or the embeddedness of some of these figures and movements in church history?
Yeah, it's both and. I mean, when I think about that first church history class I had with Jason Lee, he was always very good about making sure that we had a very hermeneutical focus in terms of what was going on, especially most memorably with somebody like Luther. But when I think about it, even now, I think about it in terms of the fact that one of the best reasons for studying church history is just simply the fact that we're not the first people to read our Bibles. Mm-hmm. And that's really comforting and liberating. So the fact that, for instance, I can read John along with Augustine, it helps me see how he's reading the scriptures, but then also contextually, he's having to deal with John in light of this huge Donatist problem, which influences how he preaches, as it should, because that's his context. He has to deal with this real issue of this split from the church and what that means for his congregants who might be tempted to break away from the Catholic Church. And so it kind of helps you see how he is dealing with the text of John while also being mindful of his own context and the challenges that he's facing. And you kind of see that from any other theologian you might pick, of just how the context is kind of being situated to how they're preaching on a particular biblical passage. And I think that that's the fun of it too, is it's not just looking at mere interpretation as such, but trying to kind of put flesh and blood on their hermeneutics in their own situation. And at a minimum, rather before rendering judgment, saying, well, why are they doing it in this way at this time? And that's a really fun, exciting question to be able to answer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because like you mentioned with Augustine, he's engaging in the some of these debates and discussions, but he's also continually preaching and teaching. So this is kind of this relationship between what's going on in his immediate context and what he's doing in his church ministry context. They're difficult to isolate, to separate.
That's right.
Yeah. So you mentioned here, we've talked in your kind of discussion, some of the early church era and the Reformation era. But in the recent book that I wanted us to kind of talk about, the recent book, Historical Theology for the Church from B&H, you have an essay on the church in the medieval era. I just wanted to see if you could tell us what are you doing in this essay? And then, like, why study the medieval era this closely? What stood out to you when thinking about the church in this particular era of church history?
I was super grateful to get the opportunity to do it. And one of the reasons I was so excited to do it is just because of how much I don't know about the medieval era. And if anything, after finishing the chapter, just realizing the unexplored ocean that still remains with the whole medieval era. But looking at it, I think one of the things that as soon as you kind of start reading is just the pervasiveness of the church, particularly for the West, is the fact that there's really not a lot of places you can go where the church isn't speaking into a particular area of your life. So it's kind of hard to imagine kind of a purely secular sphere of the world at the time. And that is what I think was so intriguing about it, and also so daunting. And it was a good reminder, just in terms of thinking about it as a historical theology, that whether it's patristic or medieval or the Reformation, it's not as if sometimes when we teach theology, it almost seems like theological categories are hermetically sealed off from one another. You have Christology and it's here, you have pneumatology and it's here. When you look in the medieval period, it would be inconceivable to think about salvation outside of the church, or pneumatology outside of any other type of, they're all a nexus, they're all interweaved. And so that you see that kind of cropping itself up all throughout the medieval period. So when you're talking about the church, you're talking about a lot of things doctrinally, theologically, at the same time. And just go ahead.
Though I was just going to say that's something that I noticed about the book as a whole, the essays in historical theology, and then your chapter in particular. When you're talking about a particular doctrinal loci, like the church or salvation in these different eras, or the nature of eschatology or something like that, you're forced to say lots of things at once, right? And figuring out that. And so I hear you saying too that there's something about the medieval era and this period of church history that's going on in the relationship between church and state that makes that even more complex. But I think it's helpful to work to think through that, because this is something that is important to reckon with when you're just doing theology or systematic theology or dogmatic theology, the interrelationship between not just the disciplines, but the individual areas of study, the loci.
Right.
But then thinking to say something true about the church in the medieval era, or in these particular ways, you're really having to say something about the theology of God and theology of salvation, and the way that those are intersecting and colliding in this particular era.
Yeah.
Why do you think there is an evangelical neglect of the medieval era? You mentioned this a little while ago. But it's, the Dark Ages, or this typically in a typical church, if they're doing church history, you might jump from, Augustine to Luther, and
Yeah,
then jump to Billy Graham or something.
yeah.
What are some of the things that, or what are some of the reasons why you think that neglect happens, or some of the unique difficulties of thinking about the medieval? Or you mentioned some of these already, but you have any general thoughts there?
Yeah, I think in a variety of levels. One, simply it's weird. For our modern sensibilities, a lot of stuff going on in the medieval period is weird, and some of it is really difficult to deal with because it is such a creative period theologically.
Mhm.
We don't know quite what to do with developments going on with the person of Mary. My gosh, what do we do with the Crusades? What do we do with the development of the papacy? And especially for Protestant ears, these things sound really strange. And the knee jerk reaction can be, well, they can be of no benefit to
Mhm.
us, as well intended as that may be. And also just by the fact that it's a huge chunk of history. I
Right.
mean, historians debate when it begins and when it ends, but let's just say, for instance, you take it beginning at 500, ending in 1500. If you do the math on it, it's 1,000 years.
Mhm.
And so that's a huge span of time that's tremendously intimidating to deal with. And that's only if you're dealing with the West, not to mention throwing in everything that's going on with the East as well. And so I think all of that together can just make us kind of loathe and just kind of what are we going to say about this era that, and again, like you said, the Dark Ages caricature, as historians like Stephen Osemont have shown, like, well, there's only a little tiny slice that's really dark because the Middle Ages is immensely creative. I mean, most of the things we have today are coming out of the medieval period, the Middle Ages. And so a lot of it's kind of dispelling the myth and the caricature. And once we kind of start to dive in, we see, oh, this is a really, really fascinating period that's
Mhm.
very instructive for us.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that one of the ways to dispel that, the myth of the medieval era, as the Dark Ages, is just start exploring in it. So that's some of the work that you did in your chapter. Um, just seeing some of the fascinating figures, and then thinking through the way in which they dealt with not just social problems, but historical issues and historical questions. Um, you mentioned two figures in your chapter, something along the lines of a tale of two Gregories.
Mhm.
What are who are these Gregories, and how are they an example of the value of studying this era?
Well, I think just in the sense that when you come with the first Gregory, Gregory the Great, who sometimes dubbed kind of the first medieval pope, who's one of the great doctors of the Latin Church, kind of seen as the first missionary pope who sends out missionaries to England. When you look at him, you see somebody who really develops the papacy significantly. And this is one of the areas I want to do more reading on, but it seems like a lot of what happens in the development of the papacy happens by this kind of unfurling of precedent.
Mhm.
It's not that Gregory the Great was necessarily looking to accumulate power. It's just the fact that there was a power vacuum in Rome, and Gregory was the only one capable of filling it. And so he kind of takes on more of these civil responsibilities in addition to his ecclesiological responsibilities. But Gregory really does see himself as a servant of the servants of God. And what I find interesting about that is just a helpful reminder that Protestants can learn things from popes. And that shouldn't be a radical thing to say, but I think sometimes that
Mhm.
sounds strange to us because of this issue of kind of ecclesiastical tribalism.
Mhm.
We couldn't possibly learn anything from any pope of any period because of our issues with the papacy itself. But with Gregory and his wonderful book, Pastoral Rule, one of the things he said in there that's always stuck with me is his concern for monks, future pastors eventually, not to ruin your doctrine with your life, not to
Mhm.
trample on your doctrine with your
Yeah.
life. And that's a really helpful reminder, I think, for all of us going into the ministry, any type of ministerial office. But when you compare that with Hildebrand, who would become Gregory the Seventh, what you find is somebody who is very much concerned about reforming the church. And I think that's also one of the helpful things about the medieval period is you find the drive for reformation doesn't start with Luther, but all throughout the medieval period, there are these moves to reform the church. There are these concerns for the purity of the church. And Gregory the Seventh has that. But the easiest means for him to reform the church is to accumulate all power within the papacy. And so because of that, he makes himself kind of this supreme pontiff on earth and is the exact opposite of Gregory the Great. Is that Gregory the Great really sees his office as trying to embody this Christ-like ideal of service, whereas for Gregory the Seventh, it's very much acquiring every semblance of power, ecclesiastical or civil, on earth. And so you kind of see a tale of two guys in the same office who go down very different paths. Granted that by the time you get to Gregory VII, the precedent of the papacy has grown a lot, and Gregory's really able to bring that all together in himself. So two different visions of what the Pope should do, two visions of what church reform looks like. They're very helpful compare and contrast in terms of the papacy, but also sort of kind of ministerial models as well.
Yeah. Yeah, because even the way you described it, two different eras essentially in the way that the church is functioning, but at the same time, still an instructive comparison and contrast of leadership styles and what they were able to do within the framework of their context. So I really appreciated the bringing those two figures out because they're they kind of exemplify the value of thinking about the medieval era, because these Gregorys are not ones that you would typically run across in Sunday school or even a MDiv curriculum. So I think that's helpful as well. So because I think sometimes it's hard as we're thinking about learning from those from our different traditions. However hard that is for us in contemporary era, looking back and specifying maybe in the medieval era or the Reformation era, seeing examples of that, both good and bad, can kind of be a way for us to kind of do that, even if it's even if the people we're listening to are in the past, maybe train our muscles to be able to do that with when we disagree with today.
Yeah.
So like to transition from just kind of the more general question, the book that this essay is in, Historical Theology for the Church. And of course, for some, that would be a misnomer. What are you talking about? How can historical theology be for the church in a way that's not just pedantic or in a way that's not just sourcing your own tradition? So more broadly, as you've thought about this over the years, since your doctoral work and some of your initial readings through the way that you have done this in the churches, in various ministry contexts for students and in scholarship, what would you say is just generally the value of church history or historical theology? Someone asking the question, why would I need this if I'm struggling to read my Bible or do theology? What is the broad value of this type of study, historical theology, or even just church history in general, for pastors, students, or interested church members? What are some of the things that you would say?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things is just once you dive into church history, it reminds the ones struggling with reading their Bibles that they're not the first person to struggle with reading their Bibles. Is that some of the great theologians we look up to had those struggles at different points of their life, or had a variety of doubts about the faith or the nature of their own lives and dark nights of the soul and things like that. I mean, I always just come back to this idea that we're not the first people to read our Bibles. And because of that, we have this wonderful tradition that we can go back and see how they've been working out questions that we have to ask ourselves every single day. So in a sense, with church history and historical theology, you just have to face, well, why would you reinvent the wheel? Is you don't have to start from a blank page. You have a wealth of information before you, and it all just kind of reminds us what John Webster taught us, that theology is always done within the domain of the church. Is that kind of church history testifies to that time and time and time again. And so, for instance, when you think about, well, one day you're probably going to be sitting in a local church and you're going to be passing a plate of crackers down the aisle, and maybe you're going to have a kid and they're going to think it's snack time and they're going to grab something, and they're going to grab a cracker, and perhaps you're going to say no. Well, then you have to explain that whole situation to that kid. Well, that's a theological question with a whole lot of significance, but that question has been answered over and over and over again throughout the history of the church in terms of what is the supper, what is the nature of the presence of Christ there, all of these questions, and they've already been answered in a variety of ways. And we get to kind of enter into that conversation. Why wouldn't you want to take advantage of that conversation? Regardless of how it explicitly comes out in teaching ministries or anything like that, we can see how the church has wrestled with these issues. And so it reminds us too that the issues we keep seeing come up over and over again throughout the history of the church kind of help key us into what are the significant things we should be looking at? What are the main things we should be worrying about within our churches?
Yeah. I like that, because we familiar with the idea of church history is really the history of interpretation, historical theology, digging into some of the implications of different readings of the scriptures. But I like the point you made that not only are we not the first ones to read the scriptures or read Paul, we're also not the first ones to struggle to read the scriptures and struggle to relate the meaning of the text to our current ministry context, whatever's going on. So I like that added dimension of not just a history of interpretation, but also a history of the reception of these texts. So of reception history of a community that's grappling with these things and struggling and fighting to grow in Christian maturity as well.
I read the new bio of Karl Barth, and we all know Karl Barth was a professor. And so for us as professors, you far more than I, we know the pressure of having to get lectures ready and get ready for the classroom. But it was one of the most fascinating things about reading this Barth bio is every time he moved to a different university, he would always emphasize how unprepared he felt, how everything was always last minute prep. He never felt ready. I mean, these are things I hear us tell each other all the time.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
And here's arguably the most significant theologian of the 20th century saying the exact same thing. And that's really refreshing. That is really refreshing to hear. Here's this guy, this Titan, and he's having the same kind of academic classroom woes that professors still have today. And I think there's even that, this little detail, man, that's helpful to know.
Yeah. So just broad patterns, but also specific vignettes or anecdotes that can help encourage us in the task, and then also shape kind of how we interact with those things. Yeah, excellent. And as we're thinking about just the process of thinking about the meaning of the text in light of the way that the church has received those texts and that theology, we've talked before. You've been thinking about this idea of reflexes in church history. What are some of the, tease that out for me? What do you mean when you talk about and teach about reflexes in the history of interpretation?
Yeah, well, I think of it in terms of a lot like, the guy behind you, Spider-Man. And when I think of Spider-Man, I naturally think of Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man. As far as I'm concerned, he's the GOAT of the Spider-Man of the superheroes. There's really no Marvel universe without Tobey Maguire, in my estimation. But when you think about that great scene in the movie where he's walking to the cafeteria and he's just got his spider powers and he slips and then he kind of reflexively grabs everything on the lunch tray. That's kind of what he reflexively does. And so thinking about when we read the Bible, where do we kind of reflexively go in our mind in terms of interpretation?
Mm-hmm.
And I like to take that question to different Bible interpreters. So, for instance, to go back to Augustine, if you kind of read through his homilies on John, you find his reflexes, for instance, to be very, very different from mine. And it was John Webster who really kind of put this point out, because John Webster, it seems, his whole project is trying to get us to reflexively begin with God over and over and over again. He's kind of always kind of making that point that just naturally, because of our need for a redeemed intelligence, we're never starting at the right point. We've got to start back here, reflexively go back here. Right. And I think you see that kind of played out in church history, is where with Augustine, he'll be talking about, in John's gospel, Jesus calling Philip, here's a man, an Israelite whom there's no guile. And then Augustine will just kind of dive into this conversation about what guile is and discuss kind of its two-sidedness. Or he will start talking about Jesus, and he will inevitably go Christological. He will go to the nature of the incarnation. He just has these different types of instincts where, even if we would say they're wrong, they kind of wake us up to ask, well, what are my instincts?
Right.
Or how am I handling a particular passage? Is do I need to read in such a way to where that muscle memory changes?
Mm-hmm.
And for doing things more automatic that I'm not doing? Because as we read more and more of these interpreters of the scriptures, it helps us refine and kind of think more about our own reflexes. So it turns it makes us better Bible readers.
Right. Yeah, I like that idea too, because sometimes when we look to a different era of church history, of interpretation, we can look at some of their readings and think, one, this is foreign, and then if we're thinking about dipping into church history just for like their interpretation of a particular text, instead of working through an entire work from them. So like what you're saying, I like that an emphasis on historical theology and church history would give you the tools in which not only to dip into one particular place where Augustine makes a comment on a text, but also to process or encounter what Augustine is doing in his homilies, or what he's doing in some of his polemical work. So as you said, so you can kind of pick up on not just the individual interpretations, but those reflexes, those the ways in which those patterns that start to develop in particular situations. And I like the way that you said this, a answer to the question of how can reading and thinking about church history and historical theology help me in my ministry. It can, one, as you identify the reflexes of a different era, it'll help you at the very least ask the question, what are some of the reflexes that are specific to me, and then also our era as interpreters, but also as preachers? Like, what do we care about? How are we engaging, the cultural moment?
Well, I think that preaching point's a good one, because when you think of C.S. Lewis's famous warning that we're all in danger of becoming chronological snobs, we can think of that in a very general level of we're just not going to read old stuff. But that can also manifest itself in terms of, well, we don't reach that way anymore, so we shouldn't follow the homiletical style of, this is, since we're talking about Augustine, for instance, because that was a different era, a different time. It's not going to really apply for modern sensibilities. Mm-hmm. And that may be true to some degree, but also when you think about Augustine, this trained rhetorician, brilliant trained rhetorician, he'll start his sermons by just very simply saying, hey guys, this is what we covered last week, and I don't have time to get into it all again, so here we go. And again, there's something kind of refreshing about the fact that Augustine's not so pressed about having kind of the right polished introduction or the right story. He's just very much concerned about getting into the scripture itself and going forward. And or thinking about the fact that, well, he might get allegorical here. Oh, well, that's just totally wrong, and we got kind of snobbish about it. But no, well, what is he doing, and why is he doing it? And is there something fruitful there that we can still harvest? So it's always kind of even checking our own snobbery, even when we like to read old stuff, like Lewis encourages us, that snobbery can sometimes run deeper than we know.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I'd like to affirm that I do think that your snobbery runs deeper than you're aware.
Oh my gosh.
This is where the interview breaks down. Yeah, no, I really like that answer.
Yeah, well, it's a good one.
Well, I'm not cutting this stuff out.
You
It's all
should.
just
Why
going to
would
cut
you?
in. Why wouldn't you? Well, yeah, just even like thinking the way that you might use a historical figure like Augustine, since we're fixating on Augustine here, that we're
We
going to
are.
become
I don't know
um,
anything about him.
Augustine home. But like the way to utilize, say, Augustine's homilies as you're preparing to preach. I mean, I remember when you were preaching several times from the Gospel of John, and you're reading through some of Augustine's homilies. Not necessarily for like you would a modern commentary where you're thinking, okay, what I have a textual problem that I need solved, so let me go to Augustine, but rather you're in the text, you're doing the work that you're to prepare to preach, but then you're also reading like Augustine's reflection on these texts, and then just kind of grappling with some of the theological realities that he's talking about in dialogue with those texts. And then when you go up to preach, some of those, as you mentioned before, instincts or reflexes show up in your preaching, even in the way that you kind of bring home a particular point or appeal to the heart in a particular way. Because I remember when you were preaching on passage John 14 through 16 on the Spirit and the relationship between the Father and Son, and we were talking about Augustine and what he was doing with those texts for like a couple weeks, and then I heard echoes of our conversation in the sermon that you preached, not necessarily like quoting Augustine necessarily, but that some of those moves that help you, uh, even just turn to the hearers and ask the question, is this true for you? Right. Which is something that you might not have just naturally been able to do if you were only thinking through, what are the exegetical commentaries, and then let me apply this point. So allowing the atmosphere or residue of the interpreters of a different era come with us into the pulpit in those ways.
But I think you make a good point in the sense that it's just the value of reading, not for just having a litany of quotes, but just for the fact that that reading is shaping you in ways you're probably not even cognizant of,
Right.
but it is kind of molding you into something different. And I think Tim Keller said this, but he said, it takes about reading 100 different authors for you to kind of figure out your own voice. And I think there's a lot of truth to that, is the value of inhabiting the whole Christian tradition, to kind of help you kind of make sense of how to read and declare the scriptures in the time God has called us to. And so I think that's just one reason why it's so valuable to keep on reading them is, even if you don't explicitly quote them, they're probably kind of there to some degree in some fashion.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's a good point too, of thinking about trying to make use of the whole tradition of the great tradition, rather than only focusing or fixating on a particular figure that comes to have an inordinate amount of influence on your teaching or preaching or thinking. So broadening that even in your study of historical theology will then help you it will fund your teaching, your preaching, and your thinking even today. Good. Well, one of the things that I'm always interested in with guests or other people as thinking about a moment or a method that you encountered that made a big impact on you in your time as a student, and then also maybe as a as a teacher, what are some of the things that have stood out to you as things that you really like to do, or things that have made an impact on you as you have gone about the teaching task?
Well, I mean, I had so many good teachers and still have so many good teachers. And the one that pops out of my mind is the one we talk about all the time. And that's where we were sitting in John Taylor's New Testament survey class. And he started at 7 p.m. there in Fort Worth Hall or Scarborough Hall, whichever one it was. And he started kind of walking us through the Gospel of John,
Mm-hmm.
walking us through and taking us through this trial motif. And by the end, by 9 o'clock, for those who had ears to hear, he basically turned it on us and asked us, well, we're on trial.
Mm-hmm.
And do you believe? And I think about that moment all the time. I mean, that was worth the price of my entire seminary education. And I wouldn't say he did anything necessarily fanciful, is he just kind of just walked us through and brought us through John in such a way that it made us feel the force of the question,
Mm-hmm.
do you believe? That's the question that you have to reckon with in your own
Mm-hmm.
life. And it was a question that was posed to presumably a bunch of Christians who were training to be ministers in some form or fashion, but it was still a question that we needed to hear. And so it's just, I think about that all the time, just in terms of that moment and how that moment came to be and the work of the Spirit in that moment.
Mm-hmm.
And just kind of those unexpected moments that you kind of have to be willing to give yourself to when you're a student, is that you have to be able
Right.
to be willing to go along for the ride. You have to have docility. You have to be willing to be teachable, but you also got to have a lot of, Aaron Burr in you as well, and be willing to wait for it.
Yeah.
You have to be willing to wait for those moments.
Right.
And there were just so many at seminary.
Yeah. I mean, we've talked about
And
that
you were
all
there.
the time. Yeah. I mean, that I feel like that's might be why it was memorable for you, but.
Well, you were asleep.
Yeah. Well, there were some people that were asleep. I remember I was actually talking to one of my classes about this. We're talking about theological and biblical studies are not only about data collection and retention. So as they're taking notes, that biblical and theological studies is a contemplative task. It's a reflective discipline. But if that's the case, sometimes you have to work through the setup or the framework in which a magical teaching moment happens.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember the way you described it was really helpful, because there was a lot of setup. In some ways it was set up, but it was laboring. He used a certain theme or motif, and he labored through the entirety of the gospel. He was showing us a way in which the gospel fit together, but also developing that. Because I thought about that moment when he turned, and it was like, it wasn't only a pedagogical trick, like the card trick that you were trying to show me earlier. It wasn't just a teaching method. He had done the work of connecting what he was talking about to the shape and feel of John's gospel as a whole. So when he made that turn, it was a turn that John himself has made. And so, like, I just remember that coming together, the weight of that question coming through in a way that I don't think we would have experienced if we hadn't have labored along with him, right? Because I know the guy that was processing email sitting beside me did not, because when it got to 9 o'clock, his watch beeped, and then he looked up and then started packing up his stuff, and then just kind of sat there like, and that was the moment we were going over time. Yeah. And that was the moment when, for me, I mean, my heart was burning in the sense of I was feeling the force of this. But if you hadn't have been along for the ride in that sense, like you said, you would have never experienced that. You would have missed it. But it took work. It took work for him to do it as a teacher, but it also took the work of us to actually be locked in that moment. And I wasn't always locked in our class, but I am glad that I am glad that I was locked in that moment. The example you gave here is a good example, as what we're trying to do as professors, thinking through Bible and theology. But it also is a call. It's a call for the students you have to want that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I want to be clear that I was completely locked in, Dr. Taylor every second.
If he
And
ever sees
number
this.
two is that, yeah, I think of it in terms of in the Jason Bourne series, when they're trying to brainwash him, they kind of ask him over and over again, do you give yourself to this program? And I really think that's the question a student has to be willing to answer.
Yeah,
It's like, do you give yourself to this program? And when I think about Taylor's
that's
class,
good.
it was not a kind of technological Disney show. If I remember right, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, he would give us these handouts and they would be, John, and then it would kind of be the outline.
Yeah.
And that's what he would walk through. And this isn't a technology in the classroom point, but this is just to say that this kind of thing can work if you're willing to give yourself to it. And it's just for us in our generation, in the moment we were in, PowerPoint wasn't as big of a thing, I don't think, then as it probably is now, or just kind of the media has changed so dramatically because we're so old. But it just to kind of show you a willingness to hear what's going on, and a eagerness for the subject that can go a really, really long way. And it pays off. It pays off.
Yeah, it's thinking as a professor seeking to communicate and connect with students, and students seeking to give themselves to the program of study, and then that's where real formative moments can happen.
Yeah,
right. That's good.
Well, you remember he would always tell us, guys, you got to give yourself to the academic discipline. That's what this is, and I still hear that all the time.
Yeah, it's a good example of we joke about it, but friendships forged in the midst of thinking, training for ministry and ministry itself.
Yep.
Are in some ways just as formative. The people that you come along with and come up with, in some ways, just as formative as the instruction we receive, for sure. Any other thoughts that you would want to say about the role of historical theology in the life of the church and the life of the pastor or seminary student or someone training in biblical studies?
Yeah, I think just in terms of the fact that the more we study historical theology and the more we study church history, I think the more and more it humbles us. The more and more it kind of shows us, and it kind of proves over and over again, the preacher from Ecclesiastes, that nothing's new under the sun. And it kind of shows us, as Rowan Williams said this so beautifully, as he used kind of a short book on church history, and he says, basically, if I'm reading 1 Corinthians 13 right, is I'm a debtor to a host of people with all of these God-given gifts. And I don't know where my debts begin, and I don't know where my debts end. And so one of the things that church history does is it reminds us how grateful we should be for the fact that we are where we are, and we have this wealth of a tradition to draw on. It is not a burden for us to bear, but it is this wonderful treasure. We can dive in like Scrooge McDuck and swim around and inhabit, and kind of treating it as the treasure it is, for life in ministry. I mean, for life. I mean, I want to know how Augustine keeps on believing to the end. Not easy, it's not a given. And so how do these guys remain faithful to the end, and gals remain faithful to the end, and in all these different difficult contexts? It's always bears repeating.
Yeah, that's a good word. That's a good word for us to end on. And I hope, honestly, that this conversation has led to you recognizing what a treasure our friendship is.
Yeah, that's exactly right. We did it. Is any of that usable?
We did it.
There's no telling in terms of
there's at least a 15-minute episode in there somewhere.